October 27th, 2013. The autumn light filtered through the windows of a Long Island home, casting long shadows across a room where one of rock music's most defiant voices was preparing to fall silent forever. Lou Reed, the man who had survived electroshock therapy, heroin addiction, artistic sabotage, and decades of self-destruction, lay in bed with his wife, Laurie Anderson, beside him. But what happened in those final hours would rewrite everything the world thought it knew about the poet who had spent 50 years building walls around his heart. The last words he spoke were not what anyone expected, and the secret Laurie kept for weeks afterward would reveal a transformation so profound that it challenged every assumption about who Lou Reed really was. The room was quiet, except for the sound of breathing. Outside, the trees were losing their leaves, the same way Lou Reed was losing his grip on the physical world. He had been sick for months, his liver failing after a transplant that was supposed to save him. The man who had written Walk on the Wild Side, who had created metal machine music as an act of pure defiance, who had loved a trans woman named Rachel when the world told him not to, was now doing something he had avoided his entire life. He was surrendering. Before we continue with what happened in that room, if you want to hear more untold stories about Lou Reed's life, the secrets behind his music, and the moments that shaped rock history, please subscribe to this channel. We bring you the stories that nobody else tells, the truth behind the legend. To understand the weight of Lou Reed's final words, you have to understand the journey that brought him to that moment. This was not the same man who had walked out of a Brooklyn psychiatric ward in 1959 with his brain scrambled by electroshock treatments. This was not the junkie who had collapsed in hotel rooms during the Berlin tour. This was not even the angry artist who had recorded an album of pure noise to punish his record label. Something had changed in Lou Reed during his final years with Laurie Anderson, something so fundamental that people who had known him for decades barely recognized the transformation. Laurie Anderson had entered Lou Reed's life in the late 1990s, two artists who seemed to speak the same language of experimental sound and unconventional beauty. She was an avant-garde performance artist, a violinist who strapped electronics to her instrument and created soundscapes that defied categorization. He was rock's darkest poet, a man whose songs about drug dealers, street hustlers, and broken people had redefined what popular music could discuss. On paper, they made sense. In reality, their relationship would become the most unexpected chapter in Lou Reed's tumultuous story. When they married in 2008, Lou Reed was 66 years old. He had spent most of his life running from intimacy, building barriers of aggression and sarcasm to keep people at a distance. His previous relationships had been marked by chaos. There was Rachel, the trans woman he had loved desperately in the 1970s, a relationship that ended in pain and silence. There were wives and girlfriends who had tried to reach the human being behind the rock star persona, only to find that Lou Reed guarded his vulnerability like a state secret. But with Laurie Anderson, something was different. She did not try to change him. She did not try to fix him. She simply existed beside him, an artist as fierce and uncompromising as he was, and somehow that made all the difference. In the years before his death, Lou Reed did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He took up Tai Chi. The man who had written Heroin and White Light, White Heat, who had embodied urban decay and chemical oblivion, started practicing an ancient Chinese martial art focused on balance, breath, and inner peace. He studied with a master named Ren Guangyi, dedicating himself to the discipline with the same intensity he had once brought to destroying his career with metal machine music. Every morning, Lou Reed would move through the slow, deliberate forms of Tai Chi, seeking a center he had spent decades trying to obliterate. Laurie Anderson watched this transformation with a mixture of amazement and quiet recognition. She understood that Lou Reed was not becoming someone new. He was finally allowing himself to be who he had always been underneath the armor. The anger, the sarcasm, the deliberate provocations, all of it had been a shield protecting a man who had been told at 17 years old that who he was wrong, was sick, was something that needed to be cured with electricity and violence. The electroshock treatments his parents had authorized in 1959 had been meant to fix his sexuality, to burn away the parts of him that did not conform to their expectations. Instead, they had taught Lou Reed that vulnerability was dangerous, that opening yourself to others meant giving them the power to destroy you. In the spring of 2013, Lou Reed's liver began to fail. Decades of drinking, years of hepatitis C, the accumulated damage of a life lived without apology, it all came due. He underwent a liver transplant in May, a procedure that was supposed to give him more time. For a few months, it seemed like it might work. He recovered enough to walk, to practice Tai Chi, to spend time with Laurie in their home. But by October, it was clear that his body was giving up. The new liver was not functioning properly. His strength was fading. The man who had survived so much, who had outlived so many of his contemporaries from the Velvet Underground days, was running out of time. Laurie Anderson later described those final weeks as a period of unexpected grace. Lou Reed was not raging against death. He was not bitter or angry. Instead, he seemed to be preparing himself the way a Tai Chi practitioner prepares for a difficult form. He talked about his life with unusual openness, sharing memories he had kept locked away for decades. He spoke about Andy Warhol and the factory, about the early days of the Velvet Underground, when they were just a group of weirdos making noise in downtown Manhattan. He talked about his parents, about the electroshock treatments, about the years of trying to prove that he was not broken. And he talked about music, about the songs that had meant the most to him, the albums that had captured something true, even when the critics did not understand. But there was something he was not talking about, something that Laurie could sense building in him like a storm gathering strength. Lou Reed was trying to find words for something he had never been able to express, a feeling that had been buried under layers of cynicism and self-protection. In his final days, as his body weakened and his breath became labored, Lou Reed was searching for a way to say what he had spent his entire life avoiding. He was trying to say goodbye, and he was trying to say thank you. And he was trying to say something even bigger than that, something that would make sense of all the pain and beauty and chaos that had been his 71 years on Earth. October 27th began like any other morning in those last weeks. Laurie woke early and checked on Lou, who was sleeping fitfully in their bed. The hospice nurse had been there the day before and had warned her that time was running out. Lou's vital signs were deteriorating. His organs were shutting down. It was a matter of days, maybe hours. Laurie sat beside him and waited for him to wake up, knowing that each moment might be one of the last. When Lou Reed opened his eyes that morning, Laurie said later that there was a clarity in them that had been absent for days. It was as if he had decided something during the night, as if he had made peace with what was coming. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, something that was part love and part relief, as if a burden he had been carrying his entire life had finally been set down. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak. Laurie leaned in close, holding his hand, waiting. What Lou Reed said in those final hours has been the subject of much speculation. Laurie Anderson has shared some of it in interviews, but she has also kept parts of it private, sacred between them. What is known is that Lou Reed talked about his life not as a series of achievements or failures, but as a journey toward understanding. He talked about the fear that had driven so much of his behavior, the terror of being seen, really seen, and found wanting. He talked about the music and how it had been both his salvation and his prison, a way to express the inexpressible, but also a way to hide behind words and sound. And then, as the morning light grew stronger and his breathing became more labored, Lou Reed did something that surprised even Laurie Anderson. He asked her to help him sit up. She arranged the pillows behind him, supporting his weight as he struggled to find the strength. And then, with Laurie holding him, Lou Reed began to move through a Tai Chi form. His movements were tiny, barely perceptible, his hands trembling as they traced the ancient patterns in the air. He was too weak to stand, too sick to do more than gesture. But he was determined to practice one last time, to find that center, that balance, that peace he had discovered so late in life. Laurie held him as he moved through the form, tears streaming down her face, understanding what this meant. Lou Reed was not fighting death. He was meeting it the way a Tai Chi master meets an opponent, with acceptance and awareness and a kind of grace that comes from complete surrender. When he finished, when his hands finally fell still, he looked at Laurie with an expression of such profound love that she said later it felt like the culmination of everything they had shared, every conversation, every moment of silence, every piece of music they had created together. The exact words Lou Reed spoke to Laurie Anderson in those final moments have been partially shared and partially protected. What Laurie has revealed is that Lou told her he was not afraid. He said that he had lived the life he needed to live, that he had said the things that needed to be said, that the music he had made was honest even when it was ugly. He thanked her for giving him the space to become who he really was, for not trying to fix him or change him, for simply loving him as he was. And then he said something that Laurie described as the most important words he ever spoke to her, words that she has kept mostly private because they were meant for her alone. But what Laurie has shared in interviews and in her own artistic work is the essence of what Lou Reed communicated in those final hours. He told her that he had spent most of his life building walls because he had been taught that vulnerability was weakness, that opening yourself to another person was dangerous. The electroshock treatments when he was 17 had been his parents' attempt to cure him of being different, of wanting things that did not fit into their narrow vision of normalcy. Those treatments had not changed who he was, but they had taught him to hide, to protect himself, to never let anyone see the fear and pain underneath the rebellious exterior. With Laurie, Lou Reed had finally found someone he did not need to hide from. She had seen all of him, the anger and the gentleness, the cruelty and the kindness, the self-destruction and the desperate desire for connection. And she had not turned away. She had not tried to fix him. She had simply been there, an equal, an artist, a partner who understood that love was not about changing someone but about witnessing them, about being present for all of it, the beauty and the ugliness alike. Lou Reed told Laurie that the Tai Chi practice had taught him something essential in his final years. It had shown him that strength was not about building walls or pushing people away. Real strength was about balance, about knowing when to yield and when to stand firm, about finding your center and holding it even when the world tried to knock you off balance. He said that he wished he had learned this earlier, that he wished he had not wasted so many years fighting battles that did not need to be fought, burning bridges that could have carried him to better places. But he also said that he did not regret his life, that every mistake and every triumph had brought him to this moment, to this room, to Laurie's arms, and that felt right somehow, like a composition finally resolving to its intended key. What makes Lou Reed's final words to Laurie Anderson so significant is not just their personal intimacy, but what they reveal about the arc of his entire life. This was a man who had been tortured by his own family in the name of normalcy, who had been told that his sexuality and his desires were diseases that needed to be cured. He had responded by creating music that celebrated the outsiders, the weirdos, the broken people who did not fit into society's neat categories. He had written songs about drug addicts and transgender women, about street hustlers and urban decay, about the beautiful and terrible reality of being alive in a world that often seemed designed to crush anyone who was different. But underneath all of that defiance and anger, there had always been a longing for connection, for acceptance, for love that did not come with conditions or demands to change. Lou Reed had found that love with Rachel in the 1970s, but he had not been ready for it then. He had been too damaged, too afraid, too convinced that letting someone in meant giving them the power to destroy him. The relationship had ended badly, and Lou Reed had retreated further into his armor, becoming even more difficult, even more deliberately provocative. With Laurie Anderson, decades later, Lou Reed had finally been ready. He was older, he had survived the worst of his self-destructive impulses, and he had somehow arrived at a place where he could accept being loved without seeing it as a threat. The Tai Chi practice had helped, giving him a physical discipline that connected his mind and body in ways that music never quite could. But more than that, Laurie herself had created a space where Lou Reed could be vulnerable without being weak, where he could open up without fear of being crushed. In his final words to her, Lou Reed was not just saying goodbye. He was completing a journey that had begun in that Brooklyn psychiatric ward in 1959, when a confused and terrified 17-year-old boy had been strapped to a table and subjected to electroshock treatments, meant to cure him of who he was. That boy had spent the next 5 decades building a career on defiance, on refusing to be normal, on celebrating the outsiders and the broken and the different. But he had also spent those decades alone, even when he was surrounded by people, because he had never quite believed that anyone could see all of him and not turn away. Laurie Anderson had proven him wrong. She had seen all of him, and she had stayed. And in those final hours, Lou Reed was able to say what he had never been able to say before. He was able to be grateful, to be vulnerable, to be open, to be human in a way that he had denied himself for most of his life. His last words to Laurie were not just an expression of love, though they were that. They were a completion, a final chord resolving, a story reaching its true ending. Lou Reed died on October 27, 2013, at 11:45 in the morning. Laurie Anderson was holding him. The Tai Chi form they had done together that morning would be his last. In the days and weeks after his death, tributes poured in from around the world. Musicians and artists, critics and fans, all shared their memories of Lou Reed's impact on music and culture. But the most powerful tribute came from Laurie Anderson herself, who spoke about Lou's final hours with a grace and honesty that honored both his life and his death. She talked about the Tai Chi, about how Lou had approached death the way he approached the practice, with awareness and acceptance. She shared that he had said he was not afraid, that he felt complete. She revealed that his last words had been an expression of love and gratitude, acknowledgement of the transformation he had undergone in his final years. And she talked about the gift Lou had given her, The gift of witnessing a man who had spent most of his life defending himself against the world, finally laying down his weapons and accepting peace. In the months after Lou Reed's death, Laurie Anderson created a multimedia piece called Heart of a Dog, which explored themes of love, loss, and impermanence. Though it was not explicitly about Lou, it was impossible not to see his influence in every frame, every word, every note. It was a meditation on what it means to love someone completely, to witness their life and their death, to hold them as they transform from living person to memory. It was Laurie's way of honoring what she and Lou had shared, and what he had given her in those final moments. Lou Reed's legacy in music is secure. He changed the landscape of rock and roll, proving that popular music could be poetic, literate, dark, and unflinching in its honesty. He wrote songs that gave voice to people who had been invisible, that celebrated the outsiders and the marginalized, that refused to look away from the ugly realities of addiction, poverty, and alienation. Albums like The Velvet Underground and Nico, Transformer, and Berlin remain landmarks of rock music, studied and celebrated decades after their release. But perhaps Lou Reed's greatest legacy is more personal than musical. It is the story of a man who was broken by the cruelty of people who claimed to love him, who spent decades building walls to protect himself, who expressed his pain and anger through some of the most powerful music ever created, and who, in the end, found the courage to let those walls come down. It is the story of transformation, of how it is never too late to change, to grow, to open yourself to love even after a lifetime of defending against it. The words Lou Reed spoke to Laurie Anderson in his final hours were his gift to her, a culmination of the journey they had taken together. But they were also a gift to everyone who has ever felt broken, different, or afraid to be vulnerable. They were proof that healing is possible, that change is possible, that you can spend most of your life one way and still, in the end, discover another way of being. Lou Reed, the man who had written some of rock's darkest songs, who had celebrated drug addicts and street hustlers, who had made an album of pure noise just to prove he could, died in peace, surrounded by love, having finally found the balance he had been seeking all along. His last Tai Chi form, performed in bed with Laurie holding him, was not just a physical practice. It was a statement, a final defiant act of grace from a man who had spent his life refusing to be what others expected. He had been told at 17 that he was broken and needed to be fixed. He had spent 50 years proving that he was not broken, that his differences were not diseases, that the outsiders and the misfits had as much right to exist and be celebrated as anyone else. And then, in his final act, he had shown something else. He had shown that even the most defended heart can open, that even the angriest voice can find peace, that transformation is always possible if you are brave enough to surrender to it. Laurie Anderson kept the specific words Lou spoke to her mostly private, sharing only what she felt honored his memory and their relationship. What she did share was the essence of his message, the profound transformation he had undergone, the peace he had found, and the love he had finally been able to express and receive. In doing so, she completed his story, giving it the ending that his music had always been reaching toward but never quite able to grasp. Lou Reed, the poet of urban decay and chemical oblivion, the champion of outsiders and misfits, had died not in anger or fear but in love. Having finally found the connection he had been seeking all along, the autumn light that filtered through the windows of that Long Island home on October 27, 2013, illuminated not just the end of a life, but the completion of a journey from brokenness to wholeness, from fear to love, from isolation to connection. Lou Reed's final words to Laurie Anderson were his masterpiece, more powerful than any song he had written, because they were completely true, completely vulnerable, and completely human. They were the words of a man who had spent his life building walls, finally speaking from behind those walls, and in doing so, dismantling them forever.